The inheritance that opened a century of horror. What would you do if you inherited a house and discovered that the previous owners had hidden something unspeakable inside its walls? Something so dark that the town had spent generations pretending it didn't exist. Would you run? Would you burn the place down? Or would you, like Sarah Collins, choose to stay and uncover the truth? This is not the story of a haunted house. It is the story of a haunted legacy. It's about secrets so vile that even the foundation stones seemed soaked with guilt. The Durham family of Millbrook, Connecticut once commanded wealth, respect, and even reverence in their community. But what they concealed behind the brick and timber of their ancestral mansion defies explanation. What began as a mysterious inheritance for a curious journalist would unravel into the largest ritual murder case in the state's history. This story is not for the faint of heart. If the idea of violence, particularly against children, or ritualistic cruelty disturbs you, this may be the time to turn away. For those who continue, be prepared. You are about to journey into one of the most disturbing family secrets ever uncovered in America. A secret that was meticulously orchestrated, generationally preserved, and until now hidden in plain sight. Sarah Collins and the Thread of Fate. Sarah Collins never thought her career would lead her to the epicenter of one of the darkest conspiracies in American history. At 28, she was a Boston-based freelance journalist with a niche in historical mysteries and cold case crimes. She wasn't famous, just respected in small circles of true crime publishing. Her pieces were thorough, meticulously researched, and tinged with a curiosity that made her stand out. But nothing in her portfolio had prepared her for what she would inherit or what she would find buried beneath floorboards and family trees. Sarah had met her great-aunt Margaret Durham only twice. The first encounter was in 2013 at Sarah's college graduation. Margaret had appeared unexpectedly dressed in dignified vintage fashion, her blue eyes sharp as glass. She offered no hugs or family warmth. Instead, she congratulated Sarah and left her with a cryptic phrase that would haunt her for years. The truth has a way of finding those brave enough to seek it dear. Remember that. The second time was at Margaret's funeral, 2 weeks before the house became legally hers. It felt surreal, an old Victorian estate in the heart of Connecticut left to her by a woman she barely knew. Sarah had assumed it was a clerical error, maybe a legal mistake. But when the paperwork arrived bearing Margaret's signature, there was no denying the truth. She was now the sole heir of the Durham estate, a place whose history was entangled with the very fabric of Millbrook's past. And as she would soon discover, that fabric was stitched together with blood. The dynasty of Millbrook, the Durham family legacy. The Durham family wasn't just well known in Millbrook, they were foundational. In the late 1800s, Jeremiah Durham, the family patriarch, built the Durham textile mill, which soon became the economic heart of the town. Alongside it, he constructed a sprawling Victorian estate in 1887, a towering 3-story mansion adorned with intricate woodwork, hand-carved cornices, and elaborate gardens. The estate spanned 12 acres and included a carriage house, servant quarters, and a greenhouse once known for cultivating rare orchids. For over 130 years, the Durhams lived in that house, wielding quiet control over the town's economy, elections, and institutions. At its height, the mill employed nearly half of Millbrook's population. And even after the mill's closure in the 1960s, the family's wealth funneled into schools, libraries, and churches. To the townspeople, they were patrons eccentric, but generous. But power breeds protection, and protection allows secrecy. When Margaret Durham died in 2019, it marked the first time in more than a century that the estate sat empty. The town's mourning was polite but distant. No one shed real tears. No one came to claim family heirlooms, and no one dared to ask what secrets might lie behind the ornate facade. For the first time since 1887, the house had no master. But it still had something to say. The house on Elm Street. A rival at a living mausoleum. Sarah's initial plan was simple: visit the house, catalog its contents, meet with a realtor, and sell it. She imagined peeling wallpaper, dusty furniture, and the bittersweet echo of a bygone era. Instead, what greeted her was something far colder. From the moment she parked her Honda Civic in the long-neglected gravel driveway, she knew something was wrong. The air felt heavy, not just with autumn moisture, but with something unnameable, oppressive, almost sentient. The mansion loomed over her like a sleeping predator, its blackened windows vacant yet oddly observant. The garden was overgrown, nature having reclaimed paths once manicured to perfection. The vines seemed to claw at the brick like they were trying to pull the house underground. Sarah felt an irrational sense of dread, like she was being watched not by a person, but by the house itself. The realtor had warned her Margaret had lived alone for years, with only a part-time caretaker visiting twice a week. No electricity, no plumbing, no central heat. Bring a flashlight, he had said, and maybe some courage. She had laughed then. But standing in front of the towering structure, the humor drained from her completely. There was something wrong with the house. And not just aesthetically. It felt like the walls held in more than silence. It felt like they remembered, breathing in the rot. A house steeped in guilt. Crossing the threshold was like stepping into another time. Heavy velvet drapes cast the interior into permanent dusk. The air was dense, thick with stillness and the unmistakable scent of decay. Beneath that, something chemical, sharp, medicinal. It triggered a wave of nausea. Sarah instinctively covered her mouth. Dust sheets covered antique furniture, but they did little to hide the grandeur beneath. Crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs, and hand-carved staircases whispered of a family that once spared no expense. Gilded mirrors reflected her flashlight like startled eyes. Oil paintings lined the walls, portraits of stern-looking men, smiling women, all framed in gold. But the deeper she walked, the more the house began to feel like a mausoleum. Time had not merely passed here, it had stopped. Everything was preserved as if waiting for someone or something to return. She told herself to leave, to come back with a realtor and an appraisal team. But curiosity coupled with a journalist's instinct pulled her deeper. She would spend the night. She had brought a sleeping bag, a notebook, a flashlight, and a camera. What she didn't know was that she had also brought a match, and the truth was soaked in gasoline. Something off. Letters to the keeper. Sarah began her exploration, methodically starting with the ground floor. The architecture was stunning in its complexity. High ceilings with decorative molding, crown archways that whispered of 19th century wealth, and fireplaces carved with motifs that felt vaguely pagan. It was in the study, a dark-paneled room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, that Sarah found her first true clue. The desk was heavy, built of mahogany and old-world craftsmanship. Most of its drawers were stuck from decades of disuse, but one had clearly been forced open. Recently the lock twisted and bent, the wood splintered slightly at the edge. Inside, a mess of crumbling papers and wax-sealed envelopes lay scattered. Sarah's hands trembled as she sifted through them, the smell of mildew and age coating her fingers. The letters were decades old, some yellowed to near brittleness, but what caught her attention was the language. They were addressed cryptically to the keeper and signed only with initials like JD or CR. The contents were equally strange. Instead of discussing business or family affairs, they spoke of preparations, the arrival of the Thomas, the protocols of harvest, and the keeper's duty to ensure alignment with the dark moon. One letter, dated 1994, stood out in particular. The Thomas arrives next month. All preparations have been made according to ancient protocols. The family is eager to proceed with the harvest. Do not delay. The window is brief. Sarah photographed every word with her phone. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just some eccentric family ritual. It sounded like a system, a cycle, a tradition passed down and meticulously followed. And something or someone called Thomas was at the center of it. Hallways of erasure. Portraits without children. The second floor felt heavier, as if the air thickened the higher she climbed. The stairwell curved gracefully beneath a massive stained glass window, depicting what appeared to be a cherub holding a black lantern. But it wasn't the architecture that unsettled Sarah. It was the hallway. Portraits lined both sides, formal family portraits dated and labeled with ornate plaques. The earliest was from 1889, the most recent from 2003. 5 generations of Durham families captured in oil and canvas. Each photograph or painting displayed parents with children arranged in traditional stiff poses. But something didn't sit right. She leaned in closer to one from 1926. It showed Jeremiah Durham, his wife Constance, and what seemed like 4 children. But to the left of the youngest daughter there was something wrong. A faint outline, the ghost of a shoulder, a discolored void where a 5th child had once been. Not a smudge, not damage, a deliberate removal. And as she moved down the hall, the pattern repeated. Every portrait had the same eerie signature, an erased child always between the ages of 12 and 16, always one missing, always replaced by that faint outline like a memory surgically removed from the family narrative. Worse still were the expressions on the faces of those who remained. The smiles were too tight, the eyes too glassy, a grotesque mix of grief and something else. Something that looked disturbingly like pride. Sarah's skin crawled as she took photo after photo, documenting the silent testimony of a family that had carefully edited history. The 3rd floor, a room preserved for sacrifice. At the top of the house, the 3rd floor was quieter still, the creaks of the floorboards more pronounced, the dust thicker. Most rooms here were guest quarters or storage except one, a child's bedroom. It was eerily well preserved. The wallpaper featured sailboats and anchors in cheerful pastel blue. A rocking horse sat by the window. A mobile hung from the ceiling, its shapes long since stilled. Everything appeared to belong to a boy between the ages of 10 and 13. But the stillness wasn't peaceful. It was haunted. Sarah's instincts screamed. Something about the far wall felt newer. The wallpaper there was slightly brighter, less faded. She stepped closer and ran her hand along it. It gave ever so slightly, like there was hollow space behind. Downstairs, she retrieved a kitchen knife from a drawer still holding utensils. Back in the room, her hands shaking, she carefully slit the wallpaper and peeled it back. Beneath it was a wooden panel. She pressed, and it creaked inward to reveal a narrow alcove. Roughly 3 feet by 3 feet, the alcove was crammed with items. Children's clothing meticulously folded, spanning generations. Diaries, photographs, all centered on one name. Thomas, a century of Thomases. The diaries that shouldn't exist. She sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, her flashlight illuminating the eerie contents of the hidden alcove. Each set of clothes was labeled with a name and date. Thomas Harper, 1926. Thomas Kellerman, 1943. Thomas Rodriguez, 1960. 6 sets, 6 eras, 6 Thomases. The clothing was pristine, preserved in a way that defied time. Wool knickers from the 20s, denim overalls from the Depression era, a NASA-branded sweatshirt from the 1990s. They smelled faintly of mothballs and something else, formaldehyde. Then there were the diaries. Leather-bound aged differently, but all written in different handwriting styles. All signed Thomas. Page after page across generations, boys named Thomas had chronicled their lives with the Durham family. Each began with near-identical entries, March 15th. Today is my 12th birthday. The Durhams welcomed me into their home. They say I'm part of the family now. Each diary documented 1 year, exactly 1 year, and each ended abruptly on the eve of their 13th birthday. With lines like "Tomorrow I become part of the family forever." Sarah's breath came in short gasps. 6 boys, 6 years, 6 ritualized vanishments. What in God's name had these people done? The original Thomas. A voice from 1926. The oldest diary bore the name Thomas Harper, dated 1926. The boy's penmanship was careful, deliberate, like a child trying to impress. His opening entries were filled with cautious optimism. They've given me this diary so I can remember my time here. Mr. Durham says it's important for family history. They call me Thomas, even though that's not my real name. As Sarah flipped the pages, the tones shifted. Quickly. March 28th. We're not allowed in the basement. Mr. Durham says it's dangerous, but I heard singing down there last night. Not like church singing. It was strange. April 10th. Margaret told me not to get too comfortable. She's my age, but seems to know things. She said, "You'll understand when it's time." What does that mean? The entries became darker, isolated, afraid. A boy being cared for, but never loved. Given everything he wanted except freedom. The final entry froze Sarah's blood. March 14th, 1927. Tomorrow is my 13th birthday. Mr. Durham says it's time for me to join the family permanently. I don't know what that means, but I'm scared. If anyone finds this diary, tell my parents I love them. It was no longer a curiosity. This was a death journal. And this boy, this first Thomas, had never left the house alive. Excellent. Here are the next segments, 11 to 15 of the Macabre History of the Durham family, each crafted into a vivid standalone narrative of 450-600 words, preserving the style-building suspense and expanding the horror. A house of hidden chambers. The network of secrets. The realization hit like a tidal wave. If one hidden alcove existed, there had to be more. Sarah's investigative instincts kicked into overdrive. She marked the child's room on a notepad and began a systematic search of the mansion room by room wall by wall. Tapping, measuring, comparing the hollow thuds behind wood paneling with the solid ones. What she discovered was a latticework of secrecy. Behind wardrobes, within closet walls, beneath floorboards, and even inside fireplace flues, she found more concealed compartments. Each one held the same chilling artifacts, children's clothing, photographs, and journals, all labeled with the same name, Thomas. Each secret cache represented a cycle, a beginning and an end. A year of immersion followed by erasure. There was a mathematical exactness to it all, almost ritualistic. The dates were spaced precisely 17 years apart. 1926, 1943, 1960, 1977, 1994, 2011. It was more than coincidence. It was a design. Sarah wasn't just uncovering a crime scene, she was decoding a blueprint for generational sacrifice. She documented everything with meticulous care, photos, diary entries, forensic notes. But the deeper she dug, the heavier the weight on her chest became. The house was no longer just malevolent, it felt alive, and it didn't want her there. Voices beneath the floor. The house begins to speak. As the sun dipped behind the tree line, the house began to shift. Creaks grew louder, shadows deepened. The temperature dropped, though the heating system, what little of it still worked, remained off. Sarah sat in the former child's bedroom, surrounded by diaries and old clothes, reading each line with increasing dread. She could no longer convince herself that she was alone. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, echoed through the hallway. She froze, her breathing shallow. Then silence. Long, oppressive silence. She pressed her ear to the wooden floor. Nothing. Then faintly, as if from beneath the board, whispers. She recoiled. It had to be her mind playing tricks. Sleep deprivation. Overexposure to trauma. But deep down, something told her it was real. The house wasn't just a witness to the crimes, it was a participant. It had absorbed the rituals, the suffering, the screams that had never reached the surface. She forced herself to focus on the evidence. One of the diaries from 1960 included a chilling entry. Sometimes I think the house breathes. At night I hear it whisper my name. I try to pretend it's just the wind, but I know better. The house remembers the others. Sarah snapped a photo and slammed the book shut. She no longer doubted it. The walls were not just stained with secrets. They were steeped in something worse, memory. The portrait gallery of the damned, children removed. Families complicit with fresh urgency. Sarah returned to the second-floor gallery of family portraits. She reviewed the photographs again, this time not with dread, but determination. Armed with dates from the diaries and recovered artifacts, she began to cross-reference. The pattern held. Each missing child had a name Thomas and a date. Every single one matched the altered portraits. But what struck her now was the expressions. The grief in the surviving family members' faces was not the despair of a tragic loss. It was guilt restrained by pride. Eyes that looked as if they had witnessed something unforgivable and accepted it. One particular painting from 1977 horrified her the most. It depicted Margaret Durham herself in her mid-50s, standing beside a young girl and a boy. Both wore formal clothing. Behind them, a faint, scratched-out outline of a teenage boy could still be seen just enough to trace the ghost of his presence. Sarah studied Margaret's expression. It wasn't remorseful. It was triumphant. These weren't accidents. The erasures were deliberate acts of concealment, ritual removals of non-members, or perhaps of sacrifices. Each erased child had lived in the house for exactly 1 year, and each had been documented, loved on the surface, then erased first from life, then from memory, and finally from the family's visual legacy. The basement door, where no one was allowed. All the diaries without fail spoke of one rule: never go into the basement. The reasons varied: chemicals, textile equipment, personal safety. But all boys had heard things. Noises beneath the floor, whispers of rituals, singing, or cries that were dismissed with half-hearted reassurances. Sarah stood now before that very door. It was thick oak, reinforced with metal, and sealed with not just one but 3 separate locks. A rusted padlock, a newer deadbolt, and a steel bar mounted across the frame. This wasn't security. This was imprisonment. Something wasn't being kept out. It was being kept in. She retrieved a crowbar from the old carriage house. It took 20 minutes to force the locks. When she finally broke the seal and opened the door, a wave of putrid air blasted her full in the face. It was worse than rot, worse than mildew. It smelled like death chemicals and old blood. The stairs descended into blackness. She hesitated, flashlight trembling in hand. Every part of her screamed to stop. But the voice that had kept her going, the one that said, "Tell the story," overpowered her fear. She took the first step down, descent into ritual. The altar of blood and stone. The basement wasn't like the rest of the house. It was older, raw, modified. The walls had been reinforced with stone, not brick. Moisture oozed from the cracks, pipes hung overhead like skeletal limbs, and in the center, an altar. It wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. A massive slab of granite carved with drainage channels that led to floor grates stained dark. Surgical tools from multiple eras hung neatly on wall hooks. Bone saws, clamps, needles, vials. Each item labeled and well preserved. Charts hung nearby, anatomical drawings focused on circulation nerve clusters and the endocrine system. They weren't for healing, they were for harvesting. Sarah's hands trembled as she walked the perimeter. On one wall, glass cases displayed bound journals, handwritten, bound in leather, carefully preserved like sacred texts. These were not the boys' diaries. These were the family's. One was open. A recent entry, Thomas number 6 has arrived. Strong, healthy. The harvest begins on the first new moon. The gift shall renew us. It was scientific, systematic. The Durham family had not stumbled into madness, they had institutionalized it. Across generations, they had refined the process, turned it into doctrine. Sarah stared at the altar and understood these boys hadn't been kidnapped. They had been groomed, prepared, and ultimately sacrificed. The journals of the keepers, scientific sacrifice. Sarah's eyes swept the basement walls, falling on the disturbing centerpiece, a library of handwritten journals bound in cracked leather and meticulously arranged in glass display cases. Each journal bore a brass nameplate, JD, 1925 MD, 1960 CD, 1984, matching generations of Durham family members. These were not hidden away in shame. They were presented with reverence as if sacred. She slid one out with trembling fingers. The ink had barely faded. It opened with a chilling declaration: the Thomas arrived today. Preparation year begins now. His blood will sustain us. This wasn't madness scribbled in isolation. It was medical, methodical. The entries outlined harvest preparation phases, including precise dosages of sedatives, fasting regimens, emotional conditioning, and physiological monitoring. They used clinical terminology: bioenergetic draw, soul extraction, point, fear, spiked essence, yield. Margaret Durham's name appeared frequently. She had not only participated, but had refined their technique. One entry described her role in extending life expectancy by 17 years with minimum decay and optimal extraction. Sarah flipped further. Diagrams, hand-drawn and annotated, revealed a grotesque fusion of science and occultism. The family believed the suffering of boys on the verge of puberty created a unique spiritual energy one they could capture and store through the ritual of transference. It wasn't metaphorical, it was anatomical. This was not the delusion of a single mad woman, it was a doctrine followed and enhanced by multiple generations. And it worked. The records showed that each harvest was followed by unnatural vitality. Illnesses, vanishing skin, rejuvenating lifespans, stretching far beyond the norm. The ritual was never questioned, only perfected. Margaret's secret, a guilty gift. Margaret Durham had seemed like a relic from another era, reserved, elegant, and distant. But Sarah now knew the truth. She was the architect of at least 4 harvests. Her journals chronicled her steady rise from reluctant participant to orchestrator. One passage written in 1994 haunted Sarah. I was younger the first time. I trembled, I cried, but I obeyed. After Thomas number 2, I no longer wept. The boy sang when he died. That made it easier. But deeper in the journal, in an entry dated just 3 days before her death, Margaret's tone shifted. They whisper to me now. All of them. The Thomases. I see them in mirrors, in reflections. I feel them when I close my eyes. Their voices are louder at night. I am too old to fight them. I have no illusions I won't cross over peacefully. They wait for me. And then I've left the house to Sarah. She's a seeker. She will listen. She will see. Maybe she will do what I never could end this. The inheritance was no accident. It was not a gift. It was penance. Margaret hadn't chosen Sarah because of familial bond. She'd chosen her because Sarah was the only one with the skills and the nerve to tell the world what had happened in that house. It wasn't a gift. It was a test. Jenny Williams. The sister who never stopped searching. Sarah wasn't the only one hunting the truth. Jenny Williams had been just 16 when her little brother Tommy vanished in 2011. The police had closed the case in 2 days' runaway. But Jenny never believed that. She knew her brother. He was shy, scared of the dark, hated being away from home. He never would have run. For a decade, Jenny collected evidence, photographs, family testimonies, school files, inconsistencies in police reports. She tracked similar disappearances in other towns, drawing a pattern no one wanted to see. She became an amateur detective, a pariah in Millbrook, branded unstable and obsessed. She had even tried to break into the Durham property in 2015. She was arrested, charged with trespassing, and publicly humiliated. But she never stopped. When Sarah found Tommy's diary, complete with his handwriting birthday entries and final chilling message, "Tomorrow, I join the family forever," she reached out to Jenny. Their meeting was raw, emotional. Jenny broke down at the sight of Tommy's words. He was telling the truth. All this time I wasn't crazy. Together they combined Sarah's physical evidence with Jenny's decade of research. The pattern became undeniable. Every 17 years, one boy, always 12 years old, always named Thomas, always from a poor or indebted family. They knew they had to act. Fast. A town built on silence. The complicity of Millbrook. In the days that followed, Sarah and Jenny interviewed everyone who would talk. Most wouldn't, but some old-timers, disillusioned clerks, a retired pastor whispered half-truths behind closed doors. Millbrook had always known. Not the details, but enough. The Durhams were the town's lifeline. During the Depression, the mill kept people fed. During recessions, their philanthropy saved schools and churches. But nothing was free. The rumor was that desperate families sometimes gave up a child in exchange for debt forgiveness or housing. It sounded like folklore, a boogeyman tale. But Harold Peaton, 78 years old, and once the assistant to the town clerk confirmed it plainly. My grandfather told me his father made the same deal. They called it the Year of the Boy. You gave up your son and the Durhams wiped your slate clean. People called it charity. It was a bargain. Blood for bread. Sarah pressed him. Why didn't anyone stop it? They were rich. We were poor. And when people said no bad things happened, fires, accidents, foreclosures, everyone knew better than to cross the Durhams. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was survival. The missing boys. Erased by systematic design. Sarah and Jenny went straight to the Millbrook Town Hall. Records from the 1940s to the 2010s lay buried in dusty filing cabinets and incomplete digital archives. But the pattern was there clear as blood on snow. 6 boys, all aged 12 at disappearance, all named Thomas, first or middle name, all from families employed by or indebted to the Durham estate, all labeled runaway. Sarah cross-referenced the boys' school records, birthdays, parent names, and socioeconomic history. Every single file had notes of sudden behavioral change, emotional withdrawal, unexplained illnesses, signs of sedation. None of it had been investigated. The sheriff's department had closed each case within 48 hours. No interviews, no search parties, no follow-ups. Each file contained the same rubber-stamped closure, likely fled to larger city in pursuit of independence. Some files even reused identical paragraphs. It wasn't laziness. It was orchestration. Sarah now understood that the Durham family hadn't just committed murders, they'd built a system to protect them. A pipeline of children, a network of silence, and a paper trail of erasure. But the papers didn't lie, and they weren't buried deep enough. The forbidden room, where the Thomas boys waited. With every file matched to every diary, Sarah and Jenny reached a terrifying certainty there had been no runaways. There had been ritualized murders. The final question was the one no one dared ask out loud. Where were the bodies? The diaries, the journals, and even the family portraits all pointed to the basement as sacred ground, the locus of the ritual. The place the boys were never allowed to enter. Sarah had already seen the altar. But now she and Jenny returned armed with new knowledge and a borrowed piece of technology, a ground-penetrating radar unit lent by one of Jenny's contacts in construction. They ran the radar slowly across the floor grid by grid. Near the far wall, the screen pulsed a deep pocket rectangular concealed behind a false stone partition. A dead space where there should have been solid foundation. They found a chisel in the tool shed, cleared debris, and began hammering. The wall gave way with a groan as if resisting. What lay beyond would haunt them forever. The trophy chamber, preserved in death. Behind the false wall was a room small, cold, and meticulously constructed. It wasn't a burial space. It was a display. 6 glass coffins, 6 skeletal forms, each enclosed in a sealed chamber lined with chemicals, tubes, and preservation systems so advanced it bordered on grotesque genius. Time had not touched the boys' remains. They were perfectly preserved as if sleeping, their faces frozen in fear, their limbs arranged with ceremonial precision. Each case bore a brass plaque. Thomas Harper, 1926. Thomas Kellerman, 1943. Thomas Rodriguez, 1960. Thomas Johnson, 1977. Thomas Chen, 1994. Thomas Williams, 2011. Beneath each boy's body lay his clothing, a labeled journal, and most disturbingly, a letter. The letters were written in the children's own handwriting. Farewells to their families, apologies, assurances that they had chosen to leave. But the writing grew more erratic with each line. Some were smudged with tears, others trailed off mid-sentence. They were written under duress, forced, final confessions from children too young to understand they were being sacrificed. Jenny fell to her knees. She sobbed. She found Tommy's letter. She whispered, "You didn't run. You never ran." And Sarah, her camera shaking in her hand, took a final photo, not for a magazine, not for fame, but for justice, the call to justice. Bypassing the town. Sarah didn't hesitate. She knew the Millbrook police would cover it up just like they had for nearly a century. She emailed every image, every scanned letter, every town hall document, and every journal entry to an FBI field office in Hartford. Within 3 hours, federal agents arrived. They sealed the property, erected floodlights, photographed every inch. Forensic teams suited up in hazmat gear as they began cataloging the room behind the wall. An FBI spokesperson, pale and visibly shaken, issued a statement to national media that night. This is one of the most elaborate and long-running ritualistic murder operations in modern U.S. history. The evidence was irrefutable. Generational murder. State and local conspiracy. Child trafficking under the guise of social debt. And worst of all, it had worked. For decades. Arrests and trials. A town built on blood. The FBI investigation unearthed what Sarah and Jenny had suspected all along. Millbrook's leadership was complicit. The sheriff's department had received monthly payments from the Durham family estate since the 1950s. In return, they ignored disappearances and closed cases early. The mayor's office had approved zoning laws to protect the Durham property from development. The local newspaper had killed multiple stories submitted over the years about children who vanished. 17 people were arrested, including 2 former sheriffs, the current deputy mayor, a retired headmaster, the town coroner who had falsified multiple death certificates. Courtroom proceedings became a media circus, but beneath the spectacle was a reckoning. Testimonies painted a horrifying picture of generational obedience and learned justification. Elders taught younger officials that these rituals protected the town, that the sacrifices were a small price for economic survival, that prosperity came not from hard work, but from blood. One chilling quote from a defendant: "We never saw them as children. We saw them as necessary. No one expected mercy. The house comes down and the garden rises." After the last trial concluded, Sarah did something many found unexpected. She donated the mansion to the families of the victims. They didn't keep it. They didn't want to turn it into a museum or a crime landmark. They had it demolished, stone by stone, room by room. The altar was torn from the basement with jackhammers. The coffin chamber was collapsed and filled with reinforced concrete. The entire house, which once stood as a symbol of wealth and prestige, became rubble within a month. In its place, they built a memorial garden. Not grand, not ornate, but sacred. Each boy had a headstone with his name photo and birth date. Jenny visits the garden every year on Tommy's birthday. I tell him what we did. I tell him he wasn't forgotten. And I promise no other child will be taken in the dark again, not while I'm alive. The grief of knowledge. A parent's worst relief. For many of the families involved, the Durham case did not bring closure. It brought confrontation. For decades, mothers and fathers had tormented themselves with unanswerable questions. Did my son run away because I failed him? Could I have done something differently? Guilt gnawed at them in the silence of unanswered prayers. And now, finally came an answer. A terrible, irrefutable answer. Your child didn't leave you. He was taken. For some, the grief was too fresh to be processed. For others, it came with an unexpected form of relief, not because the pain lessened, but because they could finally stop blaming themselves. One mother, Annabelle Rodriguez, whose son Thomas disappeared in 1960, spoke to a news outlet after the exhumation of her son's remains. For 40 years, I blamed myself. I thought maybe I was too strict. Maybe he ran away because he hated me. But he didn't. He was murdered. That hurts more than anything I've ever known, but at least now I can stop punishing myself. Psychologists called it grief, reframed the brutal but necessary transformation of guilt into mourning. And for the first time in generations, the parents of Millbrook were allowed to grieve openly without fear or denial. The Garden of the Lost, remembering the Thomas boys. The Durham estate was demolished in silence. No photographers, no ceremonies. Just bulldozers and dust and the sound of ghosts being released. In its place now stands a memorial garden, not large, not lavish, but sacred. 6 black granite headstones line a cobbled path, each engraved with a name, a photo, and the same epitaph: he was not forgotten. He is not erased. The garden is tended by volunteers, former townspeople now awakened from denial. School children are brought here on field trips. Survivors of other cult abuse groups have visited to lay flowers and letters. Jenny Williams visits every year on her brother's birthday. I bring him stories. I sit by his stone and talk to him like he never left. I tell him about the laws that changed about the other boys we saved. I tell him he mattered, that his death ended something awful. No one goes to the garden without leaving changed. It isn't just a site of mourning, it's a beacon. A reminder that silence protects monsters, but truth can bury them. Meeting the others. Families of grief. United in purpose. In the wake of the Durham revelations, something unexpected blossomed a community. Families of the victims, once isolated in shame and secrecy, found one another. A support group formed called the Silent Year, named after the single year each Thomas lived with the Durhams. What began as a private online forum soon became a national non-profit dedicated to supporting families of ritual abuse victims, lobbying for transparency and child protection investigations, creating educational materials on recognizing systemic grooming in small towns. Their motto is simple: we believed alone. We heal together. Monthly gatherings are held sometimes at the Millbrook Memorial Garden, sometimes in other towns undergoing similar reckonings. Parents speak, siblings cry, and candles are lit. And most importantly, stories are shared so the victims are no longer just names etched on stone. They are boys with favorite songs, bad handwriting, and dreams that never got to grow. Sarah and Jenny, the seekers of truth. Sarah Collins never returned to journalism in the traditional sense. She never took a book deal, never sold film rights, never signed a media contract. But she did something more powerful. She became a guardian of the story. She and Jenny co-authored a private archive called The Thomas Record, a 1,000-page digital vault of every journal entry, every file, every letter and photo. It's free, it's public, and it's unalterable. They lecture together at universities and law enforcement academies. Jenny speaks from the place of pain and persistence. Sarah from the threshold between the living and the dead. "I didn't choose this story," Sarah once said. "It chose me." Margaret gave me the house not out of kindness but guilt. She handed me a poisoned chalice, and I drank it so no one else would. They remain friends. Sisters in mission. Neither of them healed, neither of them whole, but both of them certain that they did what had to be done. The legacy of the Thomases. Names etched in stone and memory. The 6 boys once known only as missing now have names that live on in textbooks, task forces, legislation, and gardens. Thomas Harper, 1926. Thomas Kellerman, 1943. Thomas Rodriguez, 1960. Thomas Johnson, 1977. Thomas Chen, 1994. Thomas Williams, 2011. Each one represents a generation stolen, a future robbed, and a warning carved in history. Their names appear in psychology textbooks under the chapter on ritual abuse normalization, in legal reform case studies, in FBI handbooks on cult detection. But more importantly, they appear in conversations, around dinner tables, in classrooms, on social media. They are no longer erased. Jenny put it best during her speech at the annual vigil. For so long we thought we were whispering into the dark. But they heard us, and now the whole world hears them. The Thomas boys didn't die in silence. Their story roared. When silence fails. A national reckoning. In the months following the exposure of the Durham legacy, something shifted across the country. The horror wasn't just in what the Durhams had done, it was in how long they had gotten away with it. For nearly a century, no one had questioned the pattern of disappearances. No one had challenged the closures. No one had risked the social cost of suspicion. The Durham case became a litmus test for accountability. States across the U.S. launched internal reviews of small-town law enforcement. Child advocacy groups began publishing audit reports on communities with high concentrations of unsolved juvenile disappearances. Emergency funding was diverted into cold case task forces with authority to override local resistance. But the most important impact was cultural. People, especially in insular towns, began to ask questions. They looked more closely at who held power, who was untouchable, and who was quietly feared. Teachers, pastors, community board members, figures once above reproach, found themselves held to new scrutiny. This wasn't a witch hunt, it was a cultural detox. One article in The Atlantic titled, "The House That Wasn't Haunted, It Was Worshipped," summed it up. The Durham mansion didn't need ghosts. The real horror was how easy it was to look the other way. The house was gone, but its shadow lingered over courtrooms, classrooms, and town halls across America. The mythology of the keepers. Belief as weapon. As Operation Black Lantern expanded its reach, one thing became clear: the keepers of prosperity were not simply opportunists, they were believers. They weren't sacrificing children solely out of cold calculation. They had created an elaborate mythology, one that mixed elements of Christian eschatology, twisted folklore, and arcane symbolism. Their private journals spoke of the thinning of the veil, the vital threshold, and the sacred offering. They truly believed that these boys taken at the precipice of adolescence were gateways to vitality, longevity, and even spiritual protection. They viewed suffering as alchemical. Death to them was a transaction, a purchase of time and power. And their rituals weren't improvised. They were codified. Books were passed down like scripture. Some were handwritten tomes with diagrams. Others were printed, bound, and labeled for initiates only. The FBI even found training materials, checklists for grooming, conversation guides for building rapport with the chosen boys, techniques to minimize resistance. One agent said they didn't just plan for compliance, they planned for doubt, for making the world think it was all just stories. The horror of the keepers was not only their actions, but how thoroughly they justified them to themselves. The system rebuilt, protocols for the vulnerable. In 2022, Congress passed the Vulnerable Communities Protection Act, named after Thomas Williams. The act required that any disappearance of a minor in a town with fewer than 15,000 residents be escalated to a state-level review within 72 hours. It banned local law enforcement from closing cases as runaways without third-party psychological assessments and cross-agency interviews. Alongside this, the FBI's Ritual Crimes Unit received permanent funding, and Operation Black Lantern expanded into a permanent interagency task force, including child services. Forensic anthropologists, digital archivists trained to read pre-internet-era paper trails, the Durham horror became a blueprint not just for justice, but for systemic prevention. No longer would wealth secrecy or social power insulate a predator network from exposure, and no longer would strange stories be ignored just because they sounded impossible. As Sarah once wrote in her final op-ed, the unthinkable happens most often in places where no one wants to think at all. The cost of knowing, trauma in the aftermath. For the families and for Sarah and Jenny, the aftermath wasn't simply healing, it was reconstruction. Jenny began experiencing recurring nightmares, often waking at 2:13 a.m., the exact time listed on Tommy's autopsy report as his estimated time of death. She began therapy with a trauma specialist, one funded by the New Victims Compensation Initiative, established using seized Durham estate assets. Sarah withdrew from public appearances. Though hailed as a hero, she struggled with profound survivor's guilt. The inheritance that had given her purpose had also brought her face to face with hell. She often wrote in solitude, maintaining the Thomas Record website and responding personally to emails from families across the country who suspected similar horrors in their communities. Both women bore the scars of what they had uncovered, not visible, but deep. As Jenny once put it, truth doesn't set you free. It sets the record straight. The grief that's yours to carry, they carried it together. The final echo, justice that speaks forever. Today, the names of the Thomas boys are no longer lost to fire, ledger, or whisper. They are carved in stone, taught in textbooks, and remembered in candlelight. Every March 15th, families gather at the Millbrook Memorial Garden, not just to mourn, but to speak their names aloud. Thomas Harper, Thomas Kellerman, Thomas Rodriguez, Thomas Johnson, Thomas Chen, Thomas Williams. Each name is followed by a bell chime, a moment of silence, then one final promise. You are not forgotten, you are not erased, you are the reason we watch. The story of the Durham family didn't end with arrests or rubble or reforms. It ends every time someone speaks the truth instead of staying silent. Every time someone asks questions. Every time someone chooses to remember. Evil hides in silence. But the Thomas boys made the world speak. And that is justice.